challenge really, I think, is in building the political will, and part of that, the challenge for all of us, I think, is to build that political will within capitals as well as within these institutions themselves. I see our asks of the World Bank as falling into three broad areas. First of all, I think that the World Bank can do a lot more to analyse the impacts of this closing space for civil society on development. We have a lot of international partners who are calling out governments for this increasingly broad and sometimes brutal attack on independent voices as human rights violations, which they very much are. But I think one space where institutions can have a real impact is if they start to recognise that this is very much a human rights problem, but it's also a problem for sustainable development. And when we don't have freedom of expression, assembly and association properly respected and protected, then it does undermine the ability for people to be able to participate in their government's own development agendas, and then to hold them to account when things do go wrong. The World Bank, I think, has a critical role to play in this space. Following the Arab Spring, the World Bank president at the time came out and said, we need to reflect on this. We made mistakes. We've been giving glowing reports of how well these countries are doing because development indicators are doing pretty well. And in doing that, we've been ignoring what people are actually saying. We've been ignoring the voices of the people. And that was great to hear, but then what we've seen in response to that awakening is the creation of a new funding mechanism for civil society within the World Bank. Funding is essential, but the bank also has a really important role to play in safeguarding space for civil society and independent voices. So the second level where the World Bank can play an important role, I think, is at the government, the country level. And here, by having a sustained dialogue with governments about the importance of, again, freedom of expression, assembly and association for development is key, and making it clear that the World Bank thinks that it's essential for people to be able to freely participate in crafting development agendas and to speak out when things go wrong. The bank now has a new tool for identifying hurdles for development. It's called a systematic country diagnostic. And that is a bank-owned document within every country. That is a key place where the bank should be identifying hurdles to participation and accountability, particularly around closing space for civil society. The third level where the bank needs to do more, I think, is at the project level. In countries where we have seen a sustained attack on independent voices, the World Bank needs to take additional measures to create a space for people to be able to participate in those projects. Part of that, I think, is including stipulants within the loan agreements with governments that people will have the independent monitors will have unfettered access to project areas to be able to monitor those projects, and the government undertaking to ensure that there won't be reprisals against people who do speak out critically against those projects. The World Bank, as I'm sure you've all heard this week, now has a new environmental and social framework, which will take effect early in 2018. One of the ways that this policy changes from the existing environmental and social safeguards is that a lot more of the responsibilities fall on governments rather than on the World Bank itself. Here in countries where there is this closing space for civil society, that's all the more concerning because it's the governments that are attacking our colleagues that are responsible. There are a couple of provisions within the environmental and social framework that give us some hope. There is a requirement for grievance redress mechanisms. There's a prohibition on reprisals against people who use these mechanisms, but it's the government that is in charge of creating these mechanisms and of monitoring for reprisals, which makes it very challenging. As the World Bank goes forward to design an implementation process for the environmental and social framework, it's our responsibility to keep them open to recognising this global attack on civil society and how they need to do their own. The bank needs to do its own due diligence to identify these problems and to prevent them at the project level.